I am so excited to share my perfect sourdough loaf recipe and how I have finally gotten to the point that I can successfully create a sourdough loaf. It's been a long journey. I started the process of getting into sourdough a few months ago, and getting starter to fully take off was a task. I felt like it was either getting moldy on me or it wasn't getting bubbly for me. And I was getting really frustrated with this process and struggling to understand how to make it work. I made some tweaks to my process, and that has resulted in finally seeing success this year with my sourdough process. I'm starting with taking my sourdough starter, which I'll show a little bit more later in the video of what my setup looks like that made my sourdough starter actually be successful. But I'm starting off with mixing together my ingredients. I take 105 grams of starter, 325 grams of cool water, 2 teaspoons of salt, and 475 grams of flour. I'm going to combine all of that together until it is well mixed. I'm going to start off with just the sourdough starter and water. And we're going to throw that flour in last, reason being that the flour, of course, is the only dry ingredient, and so that takes some time to fully saturate into this wet mix. And so we'll want to put that in last so that we can ensure that everything has been properly saturated so that you get the texture and the consistency that you want with your loaf. When it comes to the actual ingredients that I'm using to put together my loaf, it's all very simple. I got this bucket of all-purpose flour just on Amazon. Salt is from Aldi, and of course my starter is homemade, with just the ingredients in that starter being this all-purpose flour as well as water. It took me about 2 weeks to get my starter in a place where it was really ready to begin being used into a loaf of bread. It's obviously winter time, and no matter where you are, I'm sure it's cooler where your house is, and that's definitely something that I noticed caused a lot of issues when I first started trying to make sourdough starter. It was simply just too cold in my house. Of course, sourdough is such an ancient way of making bread, and I laugh thinking about the modern, amazing invention of air conditioning is actually getting in the way of me making this wonderful ancient bread process. So I needed to warm things up a little bit, and the best way that I have been able to find to keep my sourdough starter in a really warm place is using a warming mat, a heating pad. I leave it on my countertop after I feed each day and let that warm up. And that has really made a big difference in how quickly my sourdough starter took off, as well as the quality. And it also prevented me from running into issues with mold. That, of course, is such a defeating feeling. And so if you've had to throw away starter because it got moldy, I completely understand how frustrating that is. And I'm grateful that I got encouraged to go back to the beginning of the process and try again, and it's really been successful this time, and I have so many exciting recipes that I'm looking forward to testing out this spring. As you can see here, this is my setup. I have 2 different starters, my warming mat, and I keep that plugged in just throughout the day. I turn it off at night, of course, for safety, but this allows that starter to warm up just a bit more to get to the point where it's able to create that bacteria that's necessary. The stretch and fold process is a messy one, but super important. You'll definitely see the first 1 to 2 stretch and folds that you're doing are going to be stickier. Of course, that all-purpose flour is still getting saturated with your starter and that water mixture. And so you're going to have some sticky hands. It might pull a little bit from your bowl, but of course, we are integrating more air into our dough so that we're going to get that gorgeous oven spring rise that we want to create a great loaf. So when you're doing this stretch and fold process, you want to avoid tearing your dough. Of course, I'm still not completely perfect at this, but it's definitely important to do so that you can maintain the structure and not end up with unnecessary air pockets in your loaf. After we have proofed our dough in the fridge overnight, it is time to prep our loaf and finally bake that bread. We're going to start with shaping our dough, which you'll want to start off with a floured surface as well as a floured Banneton bowl so that helps to hold it into shape before we put it into our Dutch oven to cook. So if you are putting your dough in the fridge overnight, it is gonna get cold, of course, and so you might have to pull a little bit to get that dough out of the bowl. But once you get that scooped out, you'll have an easier time actually managing it to get it into that shape that we want. What I've noticed with proofing in the fridge compared to proofing it at room temp overnight is that it allows for a better spring in the oven and just allows for that bread to rise even more. So definitely my recommendation, but of course you are always able to also just proof it at room temp overnight until it has doubled in size after you've completed those stretch and folds. So you'll see my method here, just working in a circular motion, getting us into a good bread shape. I'm also going to pull the seams together so that everything is tight and in place before we put it here into our bowl to get ready for the last couple steps of our process. What I'll do once I shape this is leave it out at room temp, and I'll go ahead and cover it as well while I go forward with the process of preparing my oven for baking. So once I have settled this dough, you can cover it with saran wrap, a paper towel, a tea towel, whatever you would like. But after this, I'm going to go ahead and move forward with preheating my oven and pulling out my Dutch oven because I'm going to want to preheat that as well in the oven for an hour before we actually move forward with that process of baking. This just allows for that heat to be distributed more evenly and not result in a super burnt bottom or not being cooked all the way through. Scoring the dough is an awesome process. I think it's fun because you can be creative. I always like to do one long score and then a few different ones throughout the side. Sometimes I do a more flowery pattern, sometimes just lines like you can see here. But this is going to allow for air and heat to more evenly distribute through that loaf so that you have a more even cook and don't have to worry about half of it being way too cooked or half of it being way undercooked. You'll want to be extra careful here when you're putting that loaf into your Dutch oven as it is hot. As you can see, I went in there with no gloves, but I have done this a few times, so I have some practice in this, but you definitely want to be careful and not burn yourself because this is hot. You might have to adjust the racks in your oven to make sure that you're putting your Dutch oven right in the center there so that, again, you're really promoting a really even cook of your bread. We're going to get this going at 500 degrees for 25 minutes. You're going to keep that lid on, and once you have completed that, we're going to take off that lid, lower that temp just a little bit, and put it back in there for that remaining 20 minutes. Once that timer is up, it is time to see your loaf, which is absolutely the most exciting part, seeing all of that hard work pay off from starting that starter to waiting that full 24 hours from when you started your mix to actually pulling that loaf out of the oven and admiring it. I recommend letting your loaf cool for at least 2 hours before you cut into it, but once you've done so, you can store it in a bread bag in the fridge, you can freeze it, or even make something delicious like sourdough croutons. Thanks for being here, and subscribe to stay along in my sourdough journey and see what we make next.